In the middle of Manila Bay, just a few miles from one of the busiest ports in Southeast Asia, there is a shape rising from the water that looks exactly like a battleship. From a distance, it has the unmistakable silhouette of a warship, a long concrete hull, gun turrets fore and aft, and a superstructure built for combat. But this vessel has never moved. It has been anchored to the same spot for over a century, because it is not a ship at all. It is an island, and what happened inside it has been sealed away from the world since 1945. The official story calls it a decommissioned fortification, a historical landmark, a war relic from another era. But not all things are what they seem. When urban explorers recently breached the sealed hatches and descended into the darkness, they discovered something that rewrites everything we thought we knew about this place. Scorched walls, melted metal, human remains scattered across the floor, untouched for 80 years. What they found has turned a forgotten military curiosity into one of the most disturbing sealed sites on Earth, and nobody wants to take responsibility for what is inside. You see, what these explorers documented in their photographs and videos is far more haunting than an abandoned ruin. The picture that emerges as their evidence comes to light reveals that this structure is not just a relic, it is a tomb, and the people buried inside were never meant to be found. Fort Drum is the only fortification in history designed to look exactly like a battleship. In the early 1900s, American military engineers looked at a small rocky island called El Fraile, sitting at the entrance to Manila Bay, and made a decision that sounds almost insane. They leveled the entire island down to the waterline. Then they built it back up as a massive concrete hull, 350 feet long and 144 feet wide, shaped precisely like the warships of the era. The walls were reinforced concrete, up to 36 feet thick in places. The armament was real battleship firepower. Twin turrets mounted 14-inch guns, the same caliber carried by the USS Texas and the USS New York. This thing could trade blows with an actual naval fleet. The genius of the design was simple. A ship can be torpedoed, a ship can be sunk. But Fort Drum was anchored to the seabed itself. It could never sink because it was never floating. The Americans built a battleship that could not be destroyed by any weapon the enemy possessed. What they did not anticipate was what would happen when it fell into enemy hands, and what they would have to do to take it back. In April 1945, American forces were sweeping through the Philippines, retaking territory that had been under Japanese occupation for 3 years. Manila had been liberated in brutal urban combat. Corregidor had fallen after fierce fighting, but Fort Drum remained in Japanese hands. The garrison inside, estimated at around 65 soldiers, refused to surrender. They were dug into a fortress specifically designed to resist exactly this kind of assault. Those 36-foot concrete walls could shrug off naval bombardment. The limited entry points made infantry assaults suicidal. American commanders faced a choice: lose dozens, maybe hundreds of men trying to storm the fortress, or find another way. They found another way. Engineers studied the original blueprints and identified the weakness: the ventilation system. On April 13, 1945, demolition teams landed on the concrete deck under sniper fire. They blasted open the ventilation shafts, and then they pumped in over 3,000 gallons of diesel fuel mixed with gasoline. When the fuel had cascaded down through the corridors and pooled in the lower compartments, they dropped in the ignition charges. What happened inside that concrete shell was not a battle, it was execution by fire. The structure became an oven. Temperatures inside reached levels that melted metal fittings and calcined the concrete walls. Every man inside died. When the flames finally burned out days later, the Americans sealed the hatches and sailed away. No recovery teams entered. No bodies were retrieved. No graves were dug. The concrete battleship became a concrete crematorium, and for 80 years, it has stayed exactly that way. Now get this. Fort Drum is not sitting in some remote ocean trench. It is right there in Manila Bay, visible from shore, surrounded by commercial shipping traffic every single day. The structure has been deteriorating for 8 decades under tropical sun, monsoon rains, and relentless saltwater exposure. The concrete is cracking, the rebar is corroding, sections of the upper deck have already collapsed inward. Unexploded ordnance from both Japanese stockpiles and American bombardment remains inside, degrading alongside everything else. The human remains documented by those explorers have never been recovered, never been identified, and never been returned to their families. Japan, the Philippines, and the United States have all avoided taking ownership of what lies within those walls. Fort Drum was supposed to be America's unsinkable guardian of Manila Bay. Instead, it became a concrete tomb holding the ashes of men who were burned alive. What is inside has been waiting in the darkness for 80 years. On October 20th, 1944, General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte and delivered the words he had been waiting 3 years to say. "I have returned. The liberation of the Philippines had begun." Over the following months, American forces pushed across the archipelago, grinding through Japanese resistance island by island. By February 1945, the battle for Manila itself was underway. It would become one of the most brutal urban battles of the entire Pacific War. Japanese Marines and Army troops fought block by block, building by building, inflicting catastrophic civilian casualties as the city burned around them. When Manila was finally declared secure, over 100,000 Filipino civilians were dead, many of them victims of Japanese atrocities committed as the occupation collapsed. American forces then turned their attention to Manila Bay. Corregidor was assaulted in mid-February. Paratroopers dropped onto the island while amphibious forces landed on the beaches. The fighting was savage. Japanese defenders held tunnels and bunkers until they were killed or sealed inside. By the end of February, Corregidor was back in American hands. But Fort Drum remained. The concrete battleship still flew the Japanese flag, and the garrison inside showed no intention of giving up. The men planning the assault on Fort Drum faced a problem that must have felt almost absurd. They were trying to capture a fortress that American engineers had specifically designed to be impervious to exactly this kind of attack. Those 36-foot concrete walls could absorb naval gunfire that would sink any ship. The limited entry points were easily defended. Any infantry assault across the exposed concrete deck would be a massacre. The Japanese garrison was estimated at only 65 men. But in a position this strong, 65 defenders could hold off a force many times their size. Conventional thinking said to starve them out. But there was no time for a prolonged siege. The war was moving toward Japan itself. Every day spent reducing bypassed garrisons was a day added to the war. Engineers pored over the original construction blueprints, searching for a weakness. They found one: the ventilation system. Fort Drum was a sealed concrete box, and sealed boxes need air circulation. Shafts ran from the interior to the outside, providing fresh air to the men living within those walls. Those same shafts could carry something else. The plan that emerged was simple in concept and horrifying in execution. Land on the deck, blast open the ventilation shafts, pour in fuel, and light it. The Japanese inside would have no escape. The concrete walls that protected them would become the walls of a crematorium. April 13, 1945, the operation commenced. The destroyer USS Picking and other support vessels approached Fort Drum under covering fire. Japanese defenders fired back from what positions they could, but American guns suppressed their resistance. A landing party of engineers and demolition specialists scrambled onto the flat concrete deck, taking sniper fire as they worked. Their objective was the ventilation shafts, and they reached them despite casualties. Explosive charges blew open the shaft covers, exposing the airways that fed the fortress below. Pumping equipment was brought up and rigged to the openings. Then the fuel came. Over 3,000 gallons of diesel mixed with gasoline were poured into the ventilation system. The liquid cascaded down through the shafts, running along corridors, pooling in compartments, seeping into every low point within the structure. The Japanese inside knew exactly what was happening. They could hear the pumps. They could smell the fuel vapor filling their world. There was no escape. The hatches were covered by American guns. The walls were 3 stories of solid concrete. Some men may have tried to find shelter in deeper compartments. Others may have simply waited. When the pumping was complete, the engineers cleared the deck. Ignition charges were lowered into the shafts and detonated. The explosion was visible from ships anchored miles away. A massive fireball erupted from every opening in the structure. The fuel ignited all at once, and Fort Drum became a blast furnace. Inside, the temperature spiked to levels that melted metal fixtures and damaged concrete surfaces from the heat. The fire consumed all available oxygen almost instantly. Men who were not killed by the initial fireball suffocated in the smoke and superheated air. Secondary explosions began as Japanese ammunition stores cooked off, adding to the inferno. Witnesses on the surrounding ships described the structure glowing from within as the fire raged through its corridors. The burning continued for days. When the flames finally died and the concrete cooled enough to approach, American forces made a decision. They were not going in. The interior was a blackened hell of collapsed debris, unexploded ordnance, and human remains. There was no strategic value in recovering bodies. There was no time for ceremony. The hatches were sealed. Fort Drum was declared secured. The fleet moved on to the next objective. Within weeks, the war had moved past the Philippines entirely. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the atomic bombs, Japan's surrender. In the rush of history's final act, a concrete tomb in Manila Bay became a footnote. Approximately 65 men who died inside were listed as casualties and forgotten. No recovery teams were dispatched. No identification was attempted. No families were notified of where their sons and husbands had actually died. The concrete battleship had served its final purpose, not as a fortress, but as a crematorium. The dead were left where they fell. By the brutal arithmetic of the Pacific War, what happened at Fort Drum barely registered. Japanese forces had committed unspeakable atrocities throughout their occupation of the Philippines. The Bataan Death March, the Manila Massacre, the systematic torture and execution of prisoners and civilians alike. American soldiers who had witnessed these horrors or lost friends to them had little sympathy for Japanese garrisons that refused to surrender. Burning them out was simply efficient. It saved American lives. It ended resistance quickly. It was war. But the men inside Fort Drum that day were not the ones who had committed those atrocities. They were soldiers following orders, trapped in a concrete box by commanders who had refused to surrender on their behalf. They were burned alive in the dark, in a structure designed by American engineers, killed by American fuel and American fire. No graves were dug, no names were recorded, no ceremonies were held. For 80 years they have remained in that darkness. And until recently, almost no one ever went back to see what was left of them. Fort Drum never disappeared. It has been sitting there in Manila Bay for 80 years, visible to anyone who cares to look. Fishing boats pass it daily. Commercial ships navigate around it. From the shores of Cavite Province, you can see the silhouette of the concrete battleship on the horizon. Officially, the site is considered a hazardous area, and access is discouraged. But enforcement is minimal, and over the years, curious visitors have found their way inside. Urban explorers, divers, photographers, and history enthusiasts have breached the rusted hatches and descended into the darkness. What they documented has turned Fort Drum from a forgotten relic into something far more disturbing. The photographs and videos that have emerged show an interior frozen in time. Equipment sits where it was left. Structural features remain intact despite decades of decay. But the evidence of what happened in April 1945 is everywhere. Walls scorched black by flames that burned hot enough to change the color of concrete. Metal fixtures warped and melted into unrecognizable shapes. And in the lower compartments, where the fuel pooled and the fire burned hottest, there are human remains, bones scattered across the debris, skulls resting against bulkheads, fragments that were once living men, left exactly where they died. No one has cataloged these remains. No one has attempted identification. No one has told the families. For 80 years, the dead have been lying in the dark, and the world simply looked away. The structure itself is dying. 8 decades of exposure to tropical conditions have taken a relentless toll. Fort Drum sits in one of the most aggressive environments imaginable for concrete and steel. Tropical heat and humidity accelerate chemical breakdown. Monsoon rains infiltrate every crack and seam. Saltwater spray constantly coats the exterior, carrying chlorides that penetrate the concrete and attack the steel reinforcement within. The symptoms of this decay are visible everywhere. Concrete surfaces are spalling, with chunks falling away to expose the corroded rebar beneath. That rebar is rusting, and as it rusts, it expands, cracking the concrete from within in a self-accelerating cycle of destruction. Sections of the upper deck have already collapsed inward, creating openings that allow even more water infiltration. The gun turrets that once dueled with warships are frozen masses of rust. Their mechanisms seized solid decades ago. Structural engineers who have examined photographs from inside the fortress warn that the deterioration is not linear. Concrete structures in marine environments can hold their integrity for a long time and then fail rapidly once critical thresholds are crossed. Fort Drum is approaching those thresholds. The question is not whether sections will begin failing catastrophically, but when. The structure sits in one of the busiest waterways in the Philippines, surrounded by fishing boats, ferries, and commercial shipping. The fire in 1945 detonated much of the Japanese ammunition stockpiled inside, but not all of it. Explorers have photographed intact artillery shells, fuses, and munitions components scattered throughout the interior. Japanese forces had 3 years to accumulate supplies inside Fort Drum. American bombardment prior to the assault added unexploded shells to the mix. Some of this ordnance has been sitting in a salt-laden environment for 80 years, undergoing the same chemical degradation that makes old explosives more dangerous, not less. The heat damage from the fire may have further compromised the stability of any munitions that survived. What this means is that any official attempt to enter the structure for recovery operations faces significant explosive hazard. A full ordnance disposal assessment would be required before systematic work could begin. Specialized teams would need to clear each compartment before remains could be recovered. The cost and complexity multiply with every year of additional decay. Fort Drum is not just a tomb. It is a bomb that has been cooking in tropical heat for 80 years, and it is surrounded by a civilian population that has no idea what is rusting away inside those walls. The most frustrating part of this entire story is that everyone acknowledges the problem exists and nobody will take responsibility for solving it. Jurisdiction is the first obstacle. The Philippines owns the territory. Fort Drum sits in Philippine waters, so the Philippine government has authority over what happens there, but the dead inside are Japanese. Under international norms, the recovery and repatriation of war dead is the responsibility of their home nation. And the United States built the structure, designed the operation, and made the decision to seal it without recovering the bodies. All 3 nations have a legitimate stake, and none of them want to pay the bill. Cost estimates for a proper operation run into tens of millions of dollars. Safe access would require structural stabilization. Ordnance clearance would require specialized explosive disposal teams. Remains recovery would require forensic specialists working in hazardous conditions. Environmental remediation might be necessary depending on what contaminants have accumulated. No single government wants to allocate that kind of money for a site that generates no political pressure. Japanese families of the dead, if any survive, have no organized voice demanding action. Filipino officials face more immediate problems than an 80-year-old tomb. American military historians consider the matter a closed chapter of a war that ended generations ago. The result is paralysis. Each year, the structure deteriorates further. Each year, the ordnance becomes more unstable. Each year, the remains become harder to recover and identify. And each year, the 3 nations that could act instead choose to do nothing at all. Japan has extensive programs dedicated to recovering the remains of its war dead from battlefields across the Pacific. Government agencies and private organizations have conducted recovery missions on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Saipan, and dozens of other islands where Japanese soldiers fell. Thousands of sets of remains have been repatriated over the decades, returned to families who had waited generations for closure. Fort Drum has been largely excluded from these efforts. The logistical challenges are part of the explanation. The site is difficult to access safely. The ordnance hazard complicates any systematic search. The structural instability makes extended operations dangerous, but other recovery missions have overcome similar obstacles. The deeper issue is that Fort Drum exists in a strange category. It is not a battlefield where men fell fighting. It is a sealed container where men were deliberately burned alive. Some Japanese families have reportedly petitioned for recovery efforts over the years, but those requests have gone nowhere. There is also disagreement about what recovery would even mean. Full excavation of every compartment? A symbolic ceremony acknowledging the dead? Designation as a permanent memorial site? Nobody has agreed on an answer because nobody has seriously tried. The men who died inside Fort Drum had families. Some of those families may still be alive. They have spent 80 years not knowing exactly where their fathers and grandfathers are buried. The answer is inside that concrete tomb, but no one will open it. Beyond the human remains, Fort Drum represents something historically unique that is disappearing with each passing year. This is the only concrete battleship ever constructed. It is a singular artifact of early 20th century military engineering, a moment when designers believed they could merge the firepower of a dreadnought with the permanence of a fortress. Nothing like it was ever built before, and nothing like it will ever be built again. If the structure collapses into Manila Bay, that history vanishes with it. Proposals have surfaced occasionally to stabilize the fortress and convert it into a memorial or museum. The Philippines has discussed heritage designation, but taken no concrete action. The reality is that preservation requires investment, and no government or private entity has been willing to commit the resources. Meanwhile, the clock keeps running. Tropical storms batter the structure every monsoon season. The Philippines sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, and earthquakes are a constant threat. Simple entropy works against the concrete and steel every single day. Fort Drum is not just dying, it is disappearing. And when it finally goes, everything inside goes with it. The United States made a tactical decision in April 1945. Burn them out rather than lose American lives in a direct assault. By the brutal logic of total war, it was justified. It was efficient. It worked. But 80 years of silence raises questions that efficiency cannot answer. What do we owe the dead, even enemy dead? What does it mean to seal a tomb and never return? Fort Drum stands as a monument to a kind of warfare we rarely discuss, not heroic charges or brilliant maneuvers. Industrial killing, fuel and fire, men burned alive inside a concrete box and then forgotten. The corridors are dark now, the walls are still scorched black, the bones are still lying where they fell, and the silence has lasted for 8 decades. What else is waiting inside Fort Drum? Do we have the courage to finally look? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see more investigations into the forgotten places where history still waits to be uncovered, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.